Could the presenters please indicate on the chat that you are here now?
Yes, I'm here. Hello.
Oh, hi.
Hi, how are you doing?
Great, great. So we'll go ahead with the first presentation. The remainder of the presenters, please still indicate to me directly in the chat that you're here. But just to remind you, the presentations, we have 4 minutes for each presentation. So we're going to be precise on that. So I'll give you an indication at 3.5 minutes
Okay.
With that. So our first presentation is by Zhenyi Zhu, Hessian amended random perturbation using noisy zeroth order oracle.
Okay. Rachel, can you see my share screen?
Yep. Looks
okay,
good.
Wonderful. Let's get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jingyi, and this work was done when I was with the Alibaba Group. And I'm happy to present here in the section of optimization and algorithm today. The topic is on the second order approximation to facilitate the random perturbation generation using noisy zeroth order oracle only. And it's dubbed as HOP for short. We'll see why we name it this way. So let's get started with the main problem setup. We are interested in minimizing a loss function denoted as the capital L with respect to the controllable variable theta that lives in a d-dimensional Euclidean space. During this optimization process, we only get to observe the noisy loss function evaluation denoted as the little l. It's corrupted by the randomness that's live in omega. Moreover, collecting one evaluation would be expensive in most of the real-world applications. Under these two characteristics, our main goal is to solve this minimization problem using as few as noisy zeroth-order queries as possible. Following this chain of thought, naturally, we want to analyze the stochastic approximation algorithms listed in here. It looks very much similar to the stochastic gradient descent methods, except that the G hat here is an approximation of the gradient information using noisy zeroth order information, not a direct evaluation of the gradient. And besides, S of k here denotes the decreasing step size. That's kind of typical. And as for the estimated G hat, we are primarily interested in the approximation scheme in equation 3, which requires 2 noisy loss function evaluations. And CK here denotes the difference magnitude, which is the amount of the step size that you would try to perturb around the current estimate, theta hat k, so that you can get a reasonable estimate afterwards. And deltas of k here denotes the random perturbation, basically the step size that you are trying to take, and that you are trying to generate a gradient approximation. And the mapping m's of k here simply denotes certain function mapping. And we will see some examples pretty soon in the slides. So the gradient approximation scheme using 2 noisy zeroth order information in previous slides includes many existing algorithms. For example, the randomized direction stochastic approximation uses a perturbation which is uniformly distributed on the unit spherical surface. And simultaneous perturbation assay uses delta, which is plus and minus 1 newly distributed. And the smooth function assay uses a perturbation that's standard normally distributed, and there are many other variants out there. But we can see here that the mapping m sub k here is an off function for convergence, for the later convergence analysis, but its form, the specific form depends on the selected distribution of the perturbation. Essentially, it's a combination of the distribution that you choose for delta k and the mapping m sub k that collectively work together so that you can obtain the convergence of the result. Overall, we can see that the perturbation has a distribution with a mean of 0 and a covariance matrix of either identity or a scalar matrix. A natural but unexplored question comes to us. What if we can incorporate information into a covariance matrix for the random perturbation. Say, by previous information, we mean that the covariance matrix sigma sub k can come from some previous observations of, say, some data-driven form that's using the information that's collected up to iteration k, or some domain knowledge that you want to incorporate if you have domain field experts. Rather than explaining the convergence analysis, I would like to explain why we motivate this sort of algorithm. Basically, why we want to incorporate non-isotropic covariance matrix into this problem using two simple examples. For example, first of all, since all the prior work that's listed in the previous slides impose an identity or scalar matrix form for the covariance matrix, this enforces that every component of the underlying parameter theta is going to be perturbed by the same amount of in the magnitude on average. And this might obstruct the optimization process. This might obstruct the optimization process if some different scalings of data are substantially different. So let's take a simple example. If we are trying to minimize this simple quadratic function here with an initial estimate in the two-dimensional vector of all ones and a difference in magnitude of 0.1. As mentioned previously, let's take SPSA as an example, which is one of the previous prior work listed in the previous slides. SPSA will generate these four random perturbations equally likely. For this simple case, the resulting estimate for the gradient is an unbiased estimate. But further assuming that we can access the noisy-free zero-thought queries, just for simplification here. In this case, the covariance matrix of the gradient estimator is going to be in the order of 10,000s. But on the other hand, if we can fit the second order information approximation into the random perturbations covariance, we can get an estimator that's also unbiased, but with a covariance matrix whose infinity norm is going to be in the order of 100, which is a kind of a saving here. Here we omit the details of constructing the Hessian estimates using noisy zeroth order informations for now, because all the details.
You need just one more minute. Sorry to.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. As we can see here, this gain in the estimation accuracy definitely benefits our optimization process later on. Second, imposing an isotropic form for the covariance matrix determines that the perturbation on every component of theta are going to be independent with each other. Nonetheless, this may not be the most appropriate choice if we can know that some components impact the underlying function towards the same or the opposite directions from our data-driven or user-specified knowledge. Again, if we look at this simple quadratic function with an extra crossterm, under this similar setup, we can have a covariance matrix generated from the previous work, SPSA, with a covariance matrix, sorry, with a magnitude of 10,000s. And that for our algorithm, if we were to fit the Hessian information into the covariance matrix, then the resulting variance of your estimator will be much smaller. And as you can imagine, this gain in the variance can be much more helpful as the dimension increases. And this is the last slides. And the two simple example on the previous slides explains why we want to fit the Hessian information into the covariance matrix for the random perturbation, basically generating random perturbations around the point that you're trying to perturb. And the generic algorithms form remains pretty much the same, except that the paper fill in the gap that we need to approximate the Hessian approximation.
We need to wrap up. We need to wrap up in a couple seconds because we have six.
Sure.
Sorry about that.
And the gain is that you get the same convergence rate, but your variance of the estimator will be much more smaller. And that's pretty much the idea of why we want to do this non-isotropic covariance matrix for the random perturbation. And that should be it. Thank you so much for the heads up, Rachel.
No worries. Thank you very much. And we'll ask questions at the Q&A at the end. Now, let's go on to the second talk. Dmitry Kuniski is going to be presenting on behalf of all of the authors, the paper Average Case and Negrelli Gap for Non-Negative Principal Component Analysis. Go ahead, Dmitry.
Oh, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks for the opportunity to present. So our paper concerns this optimization problem here. What is this? This is like an eigenvalue problem. So like calculating the largest eigenvalue of a symmetric matrix W, except subject to this extra constraint that introduces lots of complications, that all of the entries of this putative eigenvector X have to be non-negative. And this is a simple model. There are many models like this, but a simple model of extracting principal components from some data when we have prior information about what those principal components should look like, in this case, that we expect them to have non-negative entries. And so under this model, what we looked at is that if we look at kind of an average case situation of this, so where this matrix input is drawn from the Gaussian orthogonal ensemble, sort of as symmetric as possible, what algorithms are effective for doing this? So this model were introduced by Montanari and Richard some years ago. And what they did was that if we scale this GOE matrix such that the largest eigenvalue is 2, then they showed that the value of this is, with high probability, approximately square root of 2. So again, due to this constraint, the value is smaller than the actual largest eigenvalue. And they showed that this is achieved by an approximate message passing algorithm that finds a good X. They also considered briefly an alternative to this, where we can formulate a semi-definite programming relaxation. I won't go through the details, but there are some standard kind of transformations that lead to a semi-definite program. This is always an upper bound on this optimization problem that we're trying to solve. And it seems in a kind of more statistical setting that this succeeds whenever the approximate message passing algorithm does. And so we expect it to also succeed in achieving the same number, square root of 2. So in our paper, we present some small numerical experiments. So the ones, kind of semi-definite programs I can solve on the laptop I'm presenting from. And these suggest that indeed this is the case, the optimizer is rank 1, etc. However, our first result shows that this is actually not the case. And in fact, the semi-definite program gives a bound that's no better than just forgetting about all this special constraint structure and bounding by the largest eigenvalue, this very naive bound. And doing some analysis, we can roughly predict that it's in fact only several orders of magnitude larger than these conveniently solvable semi-definite programs that we would see this effect. And so the first conclusion we can draw from this is that probably in general, it might be quite dangerous to try to extrapolate these asymptotic behaviors of semi-definite programs, which we're quite interested in, from these computations that are tractable easily with off-the-shelf solvers on commodity hardware. Now, okay, another question we thought about was, is there some improvement, some enhancement of this SDP in the same family of algorithms, but that overcomes whatever this obstacle is? So here's a very general way to formulate this question. We ask for what we call a certification algorithm. What is that? That's an algorithm. It outputs a number from this matrix. The number is always an upper bound on the underlying optimization problem, no matter what the input. Typically, it does better than this spectral bound, or the SDP, by some margin epsilon under this particular random model. And it's computable at all remotely efficiently, just a little bit better than exponential time. And what we show is that under a certain technical assumption, which has become popular in a certain line of work recently, this is impossible. These three conditions cannot be satisfied by an algorithm. And so what we learn from this second statement is that this joins actually a quite large class of these so-called constrained PCA problems. So these symmetric random problems under some entry-wise constraints on this vector X, for which this spectral bound is an optimal, efficient, or even remotely efficient certification algorithm. So thanks for your time. Happy to answer questions at the end.
Thank you, Dimitri. All right, we're going to now move on to Chao Ma, who will be presenting on behalf of all the authors for a qualitative study of the dynamic behavior for adaptive gradient algorithms. Chao, the screen, I see everything looks good, so
Hi.
floor is yours.
You can see my screen, right? Okay,
Yes.
hi. Today I'm gonna share the work, a qualitative study of the dynamic behavior of adaptive gradient algorithms. This is a joint work with Lei Wu and Professor Weinan. In this work, we study the behavior in the optimization process of adaptive gradient methods, especially IMS-prop and ADAM, which are widely used in training neural networks. The iteration schemes are given here. And in the bottom, we give a typical loss curve produced by IMS-prop. And from this loss curve and many others, we summarize 3 typical behaviors of the loss curve. Firstly, there is a fast initial convergence, followed by small oscillations. And then we can see some large spikes in the loss curve that brings a loss to the big level. And in this work, we try to provide some theoretical understanding for some of these phenomena. Firstly, we come from fast initial convergence, and we try to understand this from the point of view of continuous limits of bringing the learning rate eta to 0. Here we consider a ADAM algorithm, and we should note that different continuous limit is achieved by treating the momentum factors alpha and beta differently. If we keep alpha and beta fixed while bringing learning rate to 0, then the speed of the dynamics of the momentums v and m becomes quicker and quicker compared to that of the iterator x. Then the limit is something like a sine GD, which only involves x and no v and m. On the other hand, if we take alpha and beta to 1 at the same time when eta goes to 0, then the speed of the v and m is fixed compared to that of the x. Then the limit is a set of ODEs containing both the iterator and the momentums. Here we first consider the left one, the sine GD limit. And the following theorem says that for a strongly convex objective function, the sine GD can converge to a global minimum in finite time. Then of course, in some stage of the optimization process, the convergence will be super linear and very fast. And at the initial phase of the adaptive of ADAM, especially when the learning rate is quite small compared to alpha and beta, we suppose that the trajectory of ADAM is close to that of a sine GD. Then this provides some partial theoretical explanation of the fast initial convergence. And then as for the small oscillation, it is a phenomenon that the iterator does not directly converge to the global minimum. Instead, it oscillates around it in the small region. This is true even for very simple objective functions like the one-dimensional quadratic function. And we try to understand this from in the phase space of both the momentum and the iterator. Here, for example, for IMS-prop, the phase space consists of 2 components, v and x. And we note that at the stationary point in this phase space, the v component equals to 0. And since v appears on the denominator of the dynamics, that means a simple linearization around stationary point tells us this point is not stable. It's not easy to be stable for the dynamics, since instead of converging to the global minimum, the dynamics will oscillate around it and keep a distance to make sure that v is not so small. Okay, finally, we study the influence of hyperparameters for ADAM. For ADAM, we have 2 hyperparameters, the 2 momentum factors alpha and beta. Here we take the second continuous limit above, as here on the right, and instead of directly considering alpha and beta, we consider A and B. And we identify 3 different regimes with different combinations of A and B. Firstly, when B is much bigger than A, we are in a spike regime where generally the loss curve decreases, but we can constantly see some large spikes in the loss curve. And when A and B are in the same order, then we can see some small oscillations. But in a large scale, the loss curve is smooth and decreases quite well. We call it the oscillation scheme, regime. And finally, when A is sufficiently bigger than B, we are in a divergence regime where the loss curve is unstable and it can usually diverge. And finally, the two heat maps here show the distribution of the three regimes. On the left, the final laws with different combinations of A and B. On the right, the distributions we categorize for the three different regimes. And we can see that the location of these regimes is consistent with our summarization in the previous page. And as a summary, in this work, we study the qualitative behaviors of Adam and IMS prop. And firstly, we summarize three typical features on the loss curve: the fast initial convergence, the small oscillation, and the big large spikes. And then we identify three behavior patterns for Adam with different combinations of hyperparameters. And numerical observations show that small and stable loss curve can be achieved in the oscillation regime, where A is approximately same to B. Thank you.
Thank you, Chao. Next, we have Amirali Agadaza, who's going to talk about bear. I will let him explain to you what bear means. Amirali, your slides look good. Everything looks good, so take it away.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. So yeah, I'm Amirali from UC Berkeley. Thanks for joining the session. Today, I'm going to talk about BEAR, our sketching algorithm for ultra-high dimensional feature selection. So what's the problem setup? So let's assume that we are given n labeled data points which are living in a massively high dimensional space. So in this case, the dimension of x is p. P can be as large as 10 to the power 15, very large. And the goal is to find a subset of features that best explains the output. So application of such massive scale feature selection can happen in genomics, proteomics, text processing, and so on. So conventional way of solving this massive problem is using a stochastic gradient descent, where we try to minimize a given loss function in order to arrive at a k-sparse feature vector, which gives us the location of these important features. But the challenge is that while the solution of the problem beta star is actually sparse, in the intermediate steps of the algorithm, beta can become dense, and we simply don't have enough memory in order to store that vector because P is really large relative to the memory that is accessible. One solution to this problem is to use sublinear data structures from streaming, particularly count sketch, which is a data structures to do counting. It enables us to count a large, let's say, P number of items using a memory that only scales with log of P, in this case, K log of P. And under this condition that only K out of the P items are occurring very frequently. So in this case, in this example, if a car passes by, I'm trying to count the number of cars from different colors. I would sketch each color to each of the 4 bins that I have here, and I increment each bucket by +1. And then at each stage of the algorithm, if I want to count an estimate of the number of, let's say, orange car, I will take the median of these 4 points. So, okay, how is that related to feature selection? Is that we can simply replace the cars from the previous examples with the non-zero coordinates of the stochastic gradient. So instead of sketching cars or colors of the cars, I'm going to find the non-zero location of the gradient, sketch the index, find the location buckets that are corresponding to each index, and I'm going to increment those buckets by the value of the gradient at that point. In fact, this is the principle of an algorithm that we have developed a couple of years ago called Mission, published in ICML. But what's the problem with this algorithm is that the stochastic gradient descent is noisy, and the sketch of the noise component of a stochastic gradient descent, which normally you can get rid of in the algorithm, will contaminate the count sketch and stay as a matter that you cannot eliminate, you cannot get rid of, and results in a waste of memory. So what we are trying to come up with in this new algorithm is a new way that you can do sketching, but you can also get rid of, or at least limit the amount of noise that's being added into the count sketch. One easy remedy that we have come up with is trying to use second order algorithm instead of first order algorithm. So the trade-off that we are going to pay is that we will pay a little bit more cost per iteration in order to find a second order gradient. But instead, as a reward, we will get less noisy gradient, which, as we see, going to result in a drastic improvement in memory accuracy trade-off of this algorithm. So in a sense, we are revealing another interesting application of second-order optimization for larger scale machine learning, which is not only better convergence, less dependent on step size parameter, but also a better memory accuracy trade-off whenever you are doing the sketching. Now, there are interesting details in terms of how you can find the inverse Hessian and do this problem in the sketching domain that I invite you to look at the paper, the way the interaction between count sketch and the limited memory BFGS, which is kind of a quasi-Newton algorithm, is very interesting. So some results, so we proved the convergence of the algorithm with the linear rate in simulations and some massive scale experiments. And for data sets, we show how you can do feature selection with drastically less amount of memory using BEAR compared to the baseline mission algorithm. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Amirali. I just wanted to say what I just posted in the chat. We will have about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. And if you have a question for one or more of the speakers now, please go ahead and post it in the chat and we'll try to get to that during the Q&A. So now we go back to Zhenyi Zhu to present her second paper, Hessian estimation via Steins identity in the black box problems. Zhenyi, go ahead. Everything looks good. Take it away. Zhenyi, are you there?
Yeah. Hi.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Oh, I think I somehow got muted. Sorry.
Okay, please go ahead. You have 4 minutes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi again. My name is Jingyi, and this talk here focuses on applying Stein's identity for Hessian estimates, again in black box optimization problems again. So let's introduce or review the problem setup if you've been to the previous talk. We are interested in minimizing a loss function denoted as the capital Out with respect to controllable variable theta. During this optimization process, we only get to observe noisy loss function evaluations denoted as the little L corrupted by randomness in omega. Moreover, even collecting one noisy evaluation will be expensive. Under these two characteristics, our goal is to solve the minimization problem in equation 1 using as few as zeroth order queries as possible. Equation 2 here resembles the stochastic gradient descent methods, except that the G hat here approximates the gradient through the zeroth order information. Equation 3 here is the stochastic variant of the Newton's method, except that both H hat and G hat are obtained from their zeroth order information. In both the generic algorithm form, the A sub k here denotes the decreasing step size. We'll skip the details for the approximation form for now. I'm sure that there are some audience who would question me why we care about approximating the second order information in the black box problems, and also the relevant floating point operation cost. And that's explained in the paper, and we'll skip it here for time's sake. Even though we might admit why we cared about Hessian estimates, we still want to review some prior works on Hessian estimates using noisy zeroth order queries only. This area can be traced back to the Fabian's work that was done with the 70s, which requires order dimension square zeroth order queries per iteration. And later on, Dr. Spohr proposes second order SPSA, which costs 4 zeroth queries per estimates. And subsequently, Prashant proposes a similar form, which costs 3 queries, but that involves multiple contrived constants and is not mnemonic friendly. Besides, we also mentioned that there are many recent work in the machine learning community that use other forms of the oracles besides the zeroth order queries. I've listed a few references here in case you're interested, but they are outside the scope of our comparison. Nonetheless, within the realm of black box optimization, the number of zeroth order queries remains to be the core budget indicator. Or equivalently, given a certain budget of zeroth order queries, what is the accuracy that you can achieve? After skipping why we care about the second order methods and briefly review the relevant previous work, we get to present our Hessian estimator motivated by the Stein's identity, whose explicit form are summarized here in equation 5 and 6. Particularly, 5 requires the density function P is differentiable, and the test function Q is differentiable and such that the right-hand side of 6 exists. Similar conditions also applies for equation 6. Setting these conditions aside, we see that equation 5 relates the zeroth-order information of the test function q on the left-hand side with the gradient of the q on the right-hand side. And similarly for 6. Of course, this is not the only form of Stein's identity, as there are other variants pertaining to discrete distributed random vectors. Anyhow, Stein's identity offers a convenient way for us to develop Hessian estimators in equation 7. Particularly, A cost 1 queries, B and C cost 2, and D cost 3. And all this elegant form in 7 requires that the random perturbation U here to be multivariate, standard, normally distributed. And this will be the last slide, Rachel. This would summarize the difference between our work and the previous work. First of all, on the basis of the same convergence rate, our estimator only requires 3 zeroth-order queries, while 2 SPSA requires 4. Besides, our method requires generating only 1 perturbation vectors via Monte Carlo simulation and tuning 1 difference in magnitude, where 2 SPSA requires generating 2 random perturbation and tuning 2 different magnitudes. As mentioned before, the core budget indicator is the zeroth-order queries. Let alone the reduced Monte Carlo simulation, our method excels 2 SPSA in terms of less zeroth-order queries to achieve the same accuracy and without any contrived constants. Second, our estimator is symmetric by construction, whereas 2 SPSA requires an extra step for manual symmetrization in the estimates. Besides the condition in the loss function, smoothness can be relaxed in some sense. And finally, the smoothing scheme of 2 SPSA is generalized in the proof. But to summarize, the gain for using Stein's identity on the Hessian estimator is the query complexity gain. And also, you can also save some Monte Carlo simulations. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you very much. And finally, we're to the last talk, which is practical and fast momentum-based power methods, and Tahsin Rabbani will be presenting.
Hi.
Okay.
Good.
Everything looks good.
Great.
Go ahead.
Hi. Today I will be presenting practical and fast momentum-based power methods on behalf of my co-authors. So what is the goal of our problem? So for any diagonalizable matrix A, we'd like to compute its dominant eigenvalue and associated dominant eigenvector. Dominant here meaning largest in terms of complex modulus. So the power method is a classical iterative program which will solve this problem assuming there is a gap between the 2 largest eigenvalues. So in 2017, Christopher Dessau and his group figured out a way to accelerate the classical method. So step 4, I highlight the crux of this algorithm, which is a descent-like iterative algorithm, which will gradually approximate the greatest eigenvalue and eigenvector. So in this algorithm, the highlight of it is this subtracted momentum term. And as you can see here, there's this momentum coefficient beta. So if beta is selected correctly, this algorithm achieves a convergence rate similar to the state-of-the-art Lanczos algorithm. The problem is that beta is very dependent on being close to this particular value, which is the second eigenvalue squared divided by 4. Of course, the problem is we run programs like this because we don't even know what any of the eigenvalues are of our matrix. So we wanted to approach this problem by figuring out if we could gradually use noisy estimates of the second eigenvalue to deploy a practical version of this power plus m algorithm. Okay, so without further ado, this is the algorithm we introduced in our paper. It's broken up into 2 phases. So in the first phase, which is called pre-m for pre-momentum, essentially you're concurrently running 2 power methods. So the first one is essentially outputting approximates of the first eigenvalue and the first eigenvector. And then we use those approximates to form what's called a deflation matrix. The important thing to note that is that this P here is an approximation of the first eigenvalue formed with the transpose matrix of the first eigenvector. If you do this exactly, the greatest eigenvalue of this deflated matrix will be the second eigenvalue. So essentially, we are using a noisy deflation to gradually approximate the second eigenvalue and the second greatest eigenvector. And these noisy eigenvectors actually work quite well in mimicking a true power plus m algorithm. This is supported by a variety of wonderful results in the field of noisy power methods. So once we have a good approximation of this ideal beta, so essentially this lambda sub 2 hat is just a noisy approximation of it, but we use this and then move straight into what's called an M phase, which is just the momentum phase. It turns out that if you set enough iterations in this pre-M phase, that your beta is just close enough, this lambda sub 2 squared over 4, to achieve essentially ideal acceleration, which now is good for us because now this is a practical implementation of the power plus M algorithm. There are theoretical guarantees for algorithm more in our paper, but just wanted to highlight the results here. So on the x-axis, so we created a variety of synthetic matrices with prescribed spectra, and here the x-axis, we are asking the algorithm to output the first greatest eigenvalue within a specified error threshold here. So these are pretty tight, and then we measure how many rounds, essentially outer loop iterations, it will take to approximate those eigenvalues within the specified error threshold. And dmPower, which is our algorithm, performs extremely well with even loose error bounds on how well we'd like to approximate the second eigenvalue. And at tighter eigengaps, it actually performs as well as the power plus M, which is running on an oracle which already knows that second greatest eigenvalue. But obviously in our algorithm, we do not know anything about the second eigenvalue a priori. So this is a much more practical implementation. So pretty happy with these results, and they perform pretty similarly. Well, they perform almost more competitively than the state-of-the-art Lanczos algorithm. So that's it in a nutshell, and there's much more in our paper. So thanks for watching.
Thank you, Tassin. Thank you, everyone. So we finished the talks, and now we have a little over 15 minutes or about a little under 15 minutes for the Q&A with all the authors. So let's start with a question for Tassin. Joanne asks, what happens if one runs these two methods simultaneously rather than sequentially?
Right. So in the pre-M phase, we are trying to ensure after a specified number of steps, which we talked about in the paper, that we have a good enough approximate of that beta, which is close enough to that lambda sub 2 squared over 4. So if we run them together, we do achieve convergence, which was quite surprising to us because we expected that beta to be very far off and throw off the program, but it doesn't. And we call this the simultaneous dmPower method. We covered it experimentally. The problem is for it were just a little bit too difficult. So that's for a future project, explaining why this works so well. But yes, if you run it simultaneously, it does still work. The convergence is about the same though with our sequential version though. But yeah, it's an interesting algorithm.
Yeah. Tassin, just to follow up, a second question is, do you believe, trying to connect to the other talks, that perhaps an adaptive gradient method might be able to be incorporated to sort of estimate on the fly the second eigenvalue? And or do you think is there some sort of stochastic variant of your algorithm in case you're in a situation where your matrix is too large to even store, and so you want to stream in blocks, say, instead of the entire matrix at once?
Right. So we've definitely, a lot of noise going on here, but yeah. So for that first question, we have talked with other researchers in this field about truly adaptive blind of spectral knowledge variants of this. Existing methods which are fully adaptive usually approach it from the optimization perspective. And we just found that there are too many caveats, and usually those algorithms require some knowledge of the spectrum, which we're just not afforded here, but we're definitely on the hunt for a fully adaptive version of our method. And as for a stochastic version, in our paper, we actually do present a streaming version of this algorithm, which essentially just samples columns from a very large matrix, could be a large covariance matrix, and it still works well. So yeah, this is readily adaptable to stochastic versions as well. Thanks for those questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so everyone remember, feel free to ask questions in the chat or in Slack, or if you prefer, you can just speak up. Let's go back to Dimitri's talk. We have a question for Tim. Dimitri, Tim. In the non-negative PCA problems, you're considering the case where the data is random, and also there's no non-negative planted signal. So are there any known SNR thresholds for recovery when there is a non-negative principal component planted plus noise? And what do your results, how do they translate to these other settings? Can we expect the SDP to be better than message passing in this case?
Yeah, so this is basically the kind of thing that's addressed by Montanari and Richard in their first paper. And so they show that, so there's some threshold, there's this more well-known thing in the unconstrained case, just a spiked matrix model with no prior information. And there's a particular SNR threshold below which you can detect or achieve some correlation with the signal with an estimator. And so in this case, they show that there's another threshold which is lower. So you need sort of less signal in order to do these things because you have this prior information about that the signal vector is non-negative. So they do this all kind of very thoroughly. They establish this threshold, the kind of curve of what inner product, what correlation with the signal you can achieve and stuff like that. Our results, I think, at least indicate that the semi-definite program can't see any of this. So we only kind of talk directly about the null model, but I think it's very natural to expect on the basis of this that the SDP will basically do the same thing that any other algorithm blind to this special structure would do. So let's say a spectral algorithm that just tries to compute the top eigenvector and do nothing else particularly special. So I would expect that if you tried to use the SDP to recover the signal, let's say there would be a gap between the signal to noise ratio that you can achieve in the spiked matrix model with no prior information and the one that Montanari and Richard show you can achieve using the prior information. But that's just a guess, and it's kind of how technically to actually analyze the SDP and show that that's the case. I think we don't quite know.
Thanks. Tim, we have another question for you. Can you comment on hardness assumptions that concerning the low degree polynomial tests?
Right, okay. Good question. So how to answer concisely. So first of all, what is the relevance of those things? So what we show is that if you can certify a bound that's better than this spectral bound on this random problem, then you can solve a certain kind of hypothesis testing problem. What is that hypothesis testing problem? It has to do with models of the top eigenspaces of your matrix. So when you certify, then you essentially prove that there is no non-negative vector that's very correlated with the topmost eigenspaces of this matrix. And you can use this to test between the kind of uniformly random subspace and one with one of these vectors kind of planted near it. So then we argue, this is the kind of softer part of the argument, that this problem is hard using this low degree polynomials framework. And that involves taking as a proxy for algorithms running in a certain amount of time, algorithms that compute polynomials that you can evaluate in that amount of time. So polynomials of some degree should be a proxy for algorithms that run in time n to the power of that degree, because kind of naively, that's how long it would take you to just by kind of exhausting the monomials, compute a polynomial like that. And so we show that in, again, a suitable technical sense, polynomials up to degree, let's say n to the 1 minus delta cannot distinguish these two things. And again, this is in some sense of like taking an expectation of the value of a polynomial. Can we make the expectation, large under this kind of alternative model and small under the null model, something like that? And we show that that can't be achieved until these degree nearly n polynomials. So that's the technical kind of underlying thing.
Thank you. Jinyi, we have a question regarding your talk on Stein's identity. In order to have a good estimation, does Stein's identity need a lot of samples to reduce the covariance, reduce the variance?
Yeah, Rachel, thank you for raising the question. Overall, the black box optimization problem cares about the zeroth order, noisy zeroth order queries only. And it's granted that collecting more evaluations would definitely reduce the variance of your gradient or Hessian estimators. Actually, Fabian's work that traces back to 70s definitely give us the estimator that's the most accurate in terms of the smallest variance of the Hessian estimator. But the cost that comes with it is that it requires collecting order D squared, basically the dimension square number of noisy zeroth order queries. And that's something sort of impractical in most of the large scale problem sets. And besides, the main philosophy of stochastic approximation is to achieve the averaging effect. Basically, the step size that you are tuning plus the random perturbation that you are generating. These two things actually, to me, means actually impacts more for the optimization process than to collecting more and more evaluations in one single iterate just to get an accurate estimate of the Hessian. Basically, the point is that since all the information that you collected are noisy, it sort of makes a little sense to stay within a point, an estimator, and find out what is the curvature around it, what is the gradient at it very accurately, because we are doing an optimization problem, not an estimation problem. Of course, the estimation accuracy definitely benefits the optimization process, but you also do not want to waste many resources on one single estimator. Hopefully that explains the point that you have to achieve a balance between the estimation process and this optimization speed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Chao, a question for you on the qualitative study of adaptive gradient methods. Two questions, actually. One is, can you comment on whether you think any of this can go from qualitative to quantitative studies, and also if it makes sense to also do such a study with Adagrad, which is, related to RMS prop, obviously. And so those are two questions for you.
Okay, so I can first start from the second one, the adagram. I believe that the adagram is something similar to the two algorithms, the RMS prop and the ADAM we studied in our work. And although, of course, the iteration schemes is different from the two, but I believe since it is also adaptive and it also takes some momentum terms on the denominator, and so I think the qualitative behavior should be somehow similar. And for the second, for the first problem, the can we turn the qualitative behavior, the study, to quantitative ones? And potentially yes, but I think I believe there will be some difficulties because the complicated formulation of the iteration for adaptive gradient algorithms. If we want to study the limiting ODs of these algorithms quantitatively, then we'll need to deal with the momentum factors on the denominator, and that is quite hard compared to like SGD, in which we don't have things on the denominator. So this is also what we want to do in the future, but I think at this stage it is there is some difficulty that prevent us from extending these studies to more quantitative ones.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone. We unfortunately now we've run out of time, so please feel free to ask the speakers questions on Slack, and speakers feel free to answer questions on Slack after this. And now we will go. sorry, I didn't bring up the schedule. Now we'll go to a break in Gather Town, and Joanne, feel free